starting off with analysis of idealism, and I'm wondering if anyone might be willing to kick us off with a reading.
Yeah, I could read.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, I'll just say I'm especially interested in this because this is a pretty much just like ideology critique, this whole session really. And with that, I definitely think there's a strong kind of materialism at work, but that's something I definitely want to talk more about. Um, but yeah, I guess we'll just start reading. Um, Those of you who happen to be philosophers perhaps glimpse that I have been returning here to a topic that is a bit out of date owing to weariness, rather than because it has received an actual solution. I'm referring to the terms quote unquote idealism and quote unquote realism. Idealism can easily be gauged. We need but look at what has been written about it by those who have expounded it. I will rely on the fact that, up to a certain point, it has not been refuted. It has not been refuted philosophically, but rather by common sense, which is realist, of course. Realist in relation to the terms with which idealism raises the question. Namely, if we listen to it carefully, that we can only know reality through our representations of it. The position, the idealist position, which if we begin from a certain schema, is irrefutable, can nevertheless be refuted, assuming we do not take representation to be a pure and simple reflection of reality. It is noteworthy that idealism has been decisively critiqued by philosophers themselves. What was initially promoted in the mythology of representation was displaced onto another mythology, one that calls into question not representation, but the function of thought qua ideology. Idealism only holds up insofar as it confuses the intellectual order with that of representation. As you can see, this can be very simply articulated. The more so in that we believe that we are equal to the task of transforming this reality. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll start from the top. One can believe oneself to be a realist when one takes thought to be something that is dependent on what, in this case, is called reality. But does that suffice? Even within the mythology, that's what I call it, of ideology as depending on a certain number of conditions, namely the social conditions of production. Is it a realist position to refer to a reality that cannot be fully apprehended as such, owing to the fact that thought is always dependent on it? All the more so in that we believe that we are equal to the task of transforming this reality. These are sweeping reflections. What I would like to point out is that this reality, about which we must consider our knowledge to be progressing, since this is the meaning of the so-called critique of ideology, is part and parcel of a subversion that we bring to reality. The question then is whether this knowledge that is progressing is already located somewhere or not. This is the question I raise with the term subject supposed to know. Science's step forward consisted in excluding what is mystical in the idea of knowledge, that is, in giving up on experiential knowledge, and constituting instead a formulated knowledge. The latter is an apparatus that develops on the basis of the radical presupposition that what we are dealing with are nothing other than apparatuses used by the subject. Science's step forward involves, moreover, the notion that the subject can be purified as such, to the point of no longer being organized in a certain discourse, a discourse that has nothing to do with opinion or doxa, and that is distinguished therefrom as being scientific. Even when this step is taken and understood, a presupposition and even a bias remains that is all the less critiqued as it is not perceived. And no serious question has been raised about its implications, which, in spite of ourselves, persist. It's just interesting how it's like a question of what can be perceived, right? That's the first thing I'm picking up on. But Matilda wanted to say something.
Yeah, I better speak before I feel like I'm going to explode with things I'm thinking about. I think that last part that we were reading is like, I get the sense that even in the subject of science that has been reduced to a prop, um, in a discourse of knowledge or something, that even this like kind of reference point, I think he calls it maybe at some points, even this view of the subject carries with it certain biases that he's going to want to like think about, and perhaps yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have a few thoughts that are like kind of tangential to that. It's just like, it seems like with Freud, maybe there's like, he's like very empirical and kind of like vacillates between like what's primary for him, between like a world outside and this internal world. And it seems like, at least in the Freud and Reich book, like there was like this strong case for this like, almost like from the inside to the outside is how like reality is constructed in a way. And it's a very strong form of idealism. And he gets into the terms like projection and introjection later. And it's like, what's kind of at stake in that discussion is like, how are we to think of like this, like this Berkeleyan subject who's like potentially also like manipulating, like the projector is shining outwards and is like manipulating their vision in some way, as though what is inside is very objective in a sense. But I'm going to stop talking for a second, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Akshay. Yeah.
No, I wanted to agree with, I think, everything that, and I just felt like there was a lot in these paragraphs, even though it was sort of very elusive, like, especially like it opens with this sort of like representation and reflection sort of being flagged as certain terms. And it's like, oh, if you take representation at its word, and you kind of believe that discourse is what exists, Twitter is the world, then like, yeah, I mean, idealism sort of like holds up. And then there's this sort of reference to, you know, dependence and sort of support and, sorry, I think what I meant to get at with all of this, and I think what Connor was saying about perception and the thing about the materialism, which I think where Lacan would say that Freud is like highly misinterpreted by Smuggle and Brunberger, because they ascribe to him a sort of on metaphysics of the body, which Freud himself doesn't really ascribe to, where like, you know, and sort of that body ontology, I think, is put forward here in this kind of model of the extimacy in relation to object A, and sort of perception and thought as censorship and freedom of thought, and all of these, like, you know, connected notions. Right, and I guess because, you know, the very next paragraph he's going on to this sort of in discovering knowledge, we conceptualize it, and we sort of make the assumption that it's already organized. There is some subject, God, that assures the unity and coherence of my thought. But then that raises the whole, you know, like the Bruno Latour and this kind of contemporary people who are talking about the fabrication of science. But I mean, part of the whole question is like, you know, does Freud discover and or invent in unconscious, you know, and like sort of, you know, I mean, and I think like Lacan keeps returning to the point of like psychoanalysis and Marxism are both like discourses that have names attached to them, right? Like in the sense that there is this sort of fundamental fabrication, discovery. Okay, I'm sorry, I feel like I really lost track of what I was saying, but
I was going to say one thing that is interesting about idealism. Once the French Revolution is concretized under the reign of Napoleon, the predominant epistemology of the professional bureaucratic class, they were known as the ideologues, and there was a certain profound idealism that was based in a highly, you could say, vulgar or even naive conception of the Enlightenment, coming out of like Diderot, this notion of the accessibility of human knowledge vis-a-vis the idea of the encyclopedia, right? And this idea of idealism was at its peak, therefore. And I think that even also, as we will see in a moment with Bishop Berkeley, because, I used to teach philosophy pretty regularly, and I would have a whole section on idealism. And I still teach philosophy, but I don't teach intro as much anymore. But I always love teaching Berkeley because, in a certain sense, if you really read what he's saying, he has a very compelling critique of materialism in a certain way, because he still actually insists. His basic position is basically that matter is senseless and inert, and that there is a kind of organ of perception, which itself is the source of the generation of anything we might dignify with the term of materialism. But this idea that materialism could generate cognition or perception or knowledge or thoughts somehow external to the organ of the mind and the eye in particular, and he's very huge on like that whole Newtonian science. I don't know. It's a bit convincing, and it's also interesting because I just anecdotally, many students are very much convinced if they first read Bishop Berkeley. He has a certain way with you. And even I would say it's not necessarily something which is reducible to some kind of like overly religious or sort of Christian notion, because he calls the organ of idealism spirit. And so this notion of spirit and mind, they're obviously synonymous. And I think even self and soul, spirit, mind are all synonymous. So anyways, that's a couple points I think that's quite interesting. It's also interesting to me, this point about subject supposed to know as God, because that's a repetition of a theme that he hits upon, I think, in the third session of Seminar 16, which of course is curious, a curious point, because it seems to me, if this is true, he makes that homology with what occurs in the day-to-day relationship between analyst and analyst and in the clinical free association exchange. That's a curious way to define, because of course subject supposed to know is an operation that the analyst must manage. But here he is referring to it fundamentally as tied up with the tradition and the lineage of God. I just found that a little interesting.
Yeah, just in the back of my mind, like although we're name checking like Berkeley here a lot, this idea that reality like appears to us like as it really is, immediately and merely, is also like, I feel as though like the kind of like Marxist Leninist position as well. Like I think even Engels like says as much, but in other words, then like I always suspect like there's something else going on in the sessions, like there's some other person being addressed. So maybe this is like an attack on like the French Communist Party, you know, who has some allegiance to Moscow and the sort of like ML party line of and so on. But yeah, actually I was gonna say something.
So there was this thing when I was speaking, I felt like I kept forgetting, and I think the word was sort of reception, but also both like stimulus response. And I think that's sort of like the notion that what you have here is like, oh, light hit the eye, and then that it created information that went to the brain. I mean, I think he's kind of going like Olive Berkeley, like, even if it's really compelling, and I haven't actually read him, so I don't know, but like, I mean, that is all based on this common sense of that's what representation is, right? That it's sort of reception. It's just like, oh, there's the body in the world. It has these senses that get information, right? Rather than it being sort of, I mean, I think the third section is really beautiful, where he kind of talks about the imagination literally lights up the world, right? So what appears in the field of perception is because of, I don't know, the light of the eye, right, in some sense. And I think this is like highly opposed to this notion of the common sense body ontology of Berkeley, right? Of it's in your head, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Barclay's position is interesting. He's like, even if, because the whole question for Descartes was this notion of a perfect being, God as a perfect being, and this conception is basically rejected by Bishop Berkeley, because the mind could, anything that we could project as a perfect being that exists external to the mind would just only always be a mere reflection of what the mind is capable of contemplating about perfection, right? So there's a certain solipsism that's implicit in Berkeley. And I mean, he is obviously tied up into this whole theological discourse, because he's a theologian, and he's writing at the time in which the theological debates are very front and center. So yeah, it's the other thing that's important is that Bishop Berkeley hints at this notion that to the extent to which, and he's taking on Plato here, we can think of something like the realm of the ideal forms, which would be tied for Plato to like a claim about the universality of morals. Berkeley rejects that, but he says that if anything, it's not morals, it's language. So abstract ideas of perfect forms could sort of only be reducible to some kind of language. But as far as I know, he doesn't fully elaborate a theory of language. So anyways, he's a very interesting figure. Luis and then Connor.
What I think is interesting about Berkeley is that he's an unusual figure, because in that time we have rationalism and empiricism. Idealism and empiricism, right? But Berkeley's idealism is not, he comes from the empiricist tradition, right? And his idealism is based on a radical empiricism, right? So it's kind of different from so far where we think about science as the reaction of the empirical experiences, right? Because Berkeley will find an idealism by going radical, finds an idealism by going to the extreme of empiricism, right? So he's a very unusual figure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like the Kantian a priori is like only possible on condition. Well, it's actually not possible for him. In some sense, it is. It's a radical empiricism which posits something divine interior to the subject. The subject possesses a mind, which is conceived of as some kind of being, which can kind of get close to conceiving of something close to God. But then you can automatically see the scandal that that would produce for the church. Here, the church would be on the side of a certain materialism against Berkeley, would they not? Go ahead, Matilda.
I have a feeling that, you know, some of this is situated at Marxism. Like, I mean, the whole question of idealism and materialism is definitely at the heart of like Lukács and like maybe the humanists who are around. And it seems like he's just kind of reposing the question as like in his own language as idealism and realism in some regard. It seems like maybe something he's saying is like, we started to conceive of the subject as like the camera obscura. Science started to like have this subject of science is like maybe slightly incompatible with the camera obscura subject, because the camera obscura subject has like an ideality to it, perhaps, that's like not permissible according to like the subject of science or something, or knowledge in that regard. But it seems like he's also saying that the Marxist, the mythology of ideology, who had critiqued the mythology of representation, who had critiqued the mythology of idealism, perhaps, that they had only displaced the problem, and that he asked the question of the people who hold the mythology of ideology, is it a realist position to refer to a reality that cannot be fully apprehended as such, owing to the fact that thought is always dependent on it? All the more so in that we believe that we are equal to the task of transforming this reality. Like, the question perhaps he's asking is like, how can we be sure of this outside if we apprehend it, if we can't fully apprehend it as such, because thought is dependent on it. Our thought is determined by this outside, according to Marxism in some way. So like, how can we be sure of it? Like, he's trying to throw some doubt upon the Marxist position, as I understand it.
Yeah, because remember, the tradition of the ideologues coming out of the Enlightenment bureaucracy, in a certain sense, I mean, it's fair to say that Marxism makes a scission on that tradition of bureaucratic, what Lacan would call in a year from this seminar, of university discourse, in the sense that what Lacan, I think, is trying to say, Matilda, regarding Marxists who put forward a conception of ideology vis-a-vis some conception of like a class worldview or Weltanschauung. Because remember, the liberal conservative Freudians that we talked about last time think that 19th century or early 20th century Weltanschauung theories of psychoanalysis as a science, they sort of appeal to that in their manuscript or in their manifesto as valid. And you'll know in the next 3 years of Lacan's teaching, 68, 69, 70, and beyond, he's insisting multiple times that psychoanalysis as a science should not be constituted on a Weltanschauung. So it's very much tied into that. And it's also very much tied into this notion of dupe, the figure of the dupe, which I think precisely is a sort of, well, it's exactly what he criticizes Lucien Goldman of being as the Marxist intellectual. So I think you're right. I think he's sort of carving out an interesting path, making two critiques at once, maybe in some ways. Connor, please.
Yeah, I was gonna basically just agree with that. I totally agree. I think he's doing two critiques at the same time, because I'm reading this as pretty much like a question of the production of appearance, but what's really in the balance here is what is the importance of the apparatus, right? So for the realist, the apparatus is outside, right? And is doing like let's say the heavy lifting of the production of appearance. And for the idealist, it's this reception of stimulus that mediates that stimulus into some kind of representation. And it seems as though Lacan is critiquing both of those things. So what's important is like how both the inside and the outside are, let's say, working off of one another. So it's a much more complex apparatus then, right? So how do we talk about
absolutely
at the same time?
Absolutely, especially because the unconscious is not grounded in a vitalist conception, meaning that it's not grounded in a theory of the body and of the drives as some kind of like chaotic flux filled zone of affect and emotion and so on and so forth. No, the Lacanian theory of the unconscious, he says in like a few pages, should be understood as reducible to effects of speech and language, right? And in that way, it's yeah, it's a rational basis of a certain form of realism, perhaps, that he's driving at here, vis-a-vis the subject of the unconscious, you know, which is very different because, again, Berkeley's whole point is that he originates he's a subjective idealist, right? So he has a subjective point for where idealism and truth claims of idealism emerge from. Like, it's so, in other words, like Berkeley has a theory of like some apparatus of the body. Yeah. Anyways. Go ahead, Matilda, Akshay, and then Luis, and then we should start to read.
Yeah, just real quick. I've gotten the sense from reading a few other pieces by him, like Science and Truth, I think is really interesting alongside some of the discussions in here. And that like, maybe like he says like he was gonna build something upon Kant's work, upon the noumena, or like the object that is inaccessible or something. And he brings up in Science and Truth this idea of like that the objects of like the older materialism or like even of Kant were like mute objects. And in this lesson, he says he wants to go from the object to the other. And I took that to mean that like what he is doing is like saying that like the objects of this science are not mute, they speak. And like the objects might be noumenal in some way. We might be alienated from them and might be able to approach them in some regard, but they do speak. They're not mute by some sort of presupposition or something. I don't know what the stakes of that are, but I found that to be pretty intriguing.
Yeah, that's his break with neo-Kantianism right there, right? That's definitely
Yes.
I think, at least at the level of epistemology, Lacan's theory of knowledge, he's not to be construed in any sense as committed to the neo-Kantian limits at that point. But on the other hand, we know that Lacan is some type of very idiosyncratic Kantian at the same time, especially as he develops certain of his concepts, especially his ethics.
Interesting.
But I think in the domain of epistemology, he's not Kantian.
Yeah.
He's more Hegelian. But we could say perhaps in the domain of ethics that he is.
Okay.
Akshay?
I mean, yeah, no, these comments are fascinating. I think that there is this question of, like this Kantian, like, we don't know what the human being is sort of capable of, but The thing I wanted to say was very to the point and specific. It's that, I mean, I think by apparatus, it's referring specifically to the realist position in the sense that only realists would make it realist by using the language of a machine. Like, that's already a kind of like, whereas to call it divine, I mean, I guess you could call it divine clockwork, and you know what I mean? It's not the same kind of, you wouldn't call it the apparatus of God. Like, and so to Matilda's question about the camera obscura, I think the camera obscura is the position of science, right? Because science, in attempting to simplify things to the most, comes up with this common sense inside-outside reception theory, which is basically a false metaphysical notion of the body. So I think that's, yeah. I mean, and that's kind of Kant's whole thing, where he's kind of like, you're not the camera obscura. You don't, like, I mean, the whole idea is just that, oh, I wander in the world and there's information and it just floods into me. And Kant is sort of like, no, it's like, where everything that is presented before me by necessity must conform to the conditions of, it being knowable for me, right? Like, so in that sense, anything I can see is, I can see because I can see it, right? Rather than I can see it. So I'm not sure if that made sense.
No, that is actually quite helpful. Luis, let's go, please, and then we will continue.
Yeah. So last session I mentioned his logic from seminar 14, the logic of phantasm. And I think this is very crucial right now because he's using this Venn diagram. So maybe it's useful to think in the same terms because, I mean, it's difficult to explain without the diagrams, but when we say A and B, what we get is the middle part in the Venn diagram, right? So Lacan is playing and says not A or not B, right? So in the Venn diagrams we have the one side or the other side, but by negating both of them, right? So if we apply that to this division between realism and idealism, Lacan will say, or not realism or not idealism, right? But so not saying that they're both at the same time, but by negating both of them, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, because I think that it's often the case that he's maybe some type of critique maybe going on in the background, but in reality he's more original because like Luis says, he's trying to ascertain and position where he sits on these issues. Connor, would you remind us, please, where you left off?
Yes. So the paragraph that starts this bias is as follows.
Okay. You haven't read that?
No.
Okay, cool. Okay, I can pick it up.
Gotcha.
This bias is as follows. In discovering knowledge, we conceptualize it, whether we like it or not, for it is endemic to thought, as already organized somewhere. Must we believe this is the case? As long as the consequences of a radical bracketing of the subject supposed to know are not tested, we remain mired in idealism. And in its most backward form, the one that is, in the final analysis, unshakable in a structure known in a word as theology. Okay, that's very helpful. Subject supposed to know is God. And that's the end of the story. One can be a genius and not an obscuranist. To the best of my knowledge, in short, one can be Einstein and explicitly resort to God. God must be supposed to already know, since Einstein, arguing against a restructuring of science on the basis of probability theory, claims that the knowledge presupposed by what he articulates in his theory is corroborated by something that is consistent with what is clearly a presupposition regarding the subject he, employing the traditional term, calls God. This good old God is perhaps difficult to fathom with regard to the world order he sustains, but he is not a liar or disloyal, nor does he change the rules in the middle of the game. This is Einstein's position, which, by the way, if you look at Seminar 3 and the psychoses, you'll see that Lacan spends a good amount of time also reviewing Einstein's theory of God as that God which does not, what is it? What is the formula? It does not take chances or something like this, or is not reducible to chance. It's like Einstein still wants. Yeah, thank you. But yeah, in some sense, God is. Einstein somehow manages to remove contingency in some way. Anyways, the rules of the game already exist somewhere. They're instituted owing to the simple fact that knowledge already exists in God. He is the one who presides over the deciphering known as knowledge. True atheism, the only atheism that deserves the name, is the atheism that results from calling the subject supposed to know into question. So you see what he's done there. He's moved to this version of God, which would place the sovereignty of God as the decipherability of knowledge. It's that form of subject supposed to know, which is very Christian, but still very essential. It's not clear that it's possible for thought to face this question, or even if formulated, it constitutes any sort of step in this direction. This is certainly not to say that it isn't a step that preoccupies me essentially, because what I have to articulate, namely psychoanalysis, is a piece with it, is of a piece with it. Yet I can but convey first what I must require of analysts, namely, that they at least have a discourse that's up to date regarding what they actually provide, analytic treatment or experience. Call it as you like, it's all the same. Indeed, their thinking is so far behind the times in this regard that it's easy to get them to realize that they account for what subjects do in treatment in terms that involve such elementary biases that they constitute a true degradation of what critical thought has been able to reach as certain turning points. Don't think for a minute that this is harmless. It has multiple consequences that run the gamut from, first, reinforcing in analysts everything that Freud says constitutes intellectual resistance to, distorting their modes of intervention, which, in the end, merely reinforce the same biases in the subject, more or less rightly said to be A, patient, for he is braided, in the very act of psychoanalytic experience. To indicate what's at stake, and it is truly blatant, I will center it around the terms inside and outside. Okay, so here he's really talking about the transference, because in the transference is when you have the experience of the subject supposed to know, right? And the analyst is shifted to inhabit this position, and this is what requires what Lacan calls the psychoanalytic act. It requires an act which he often says is not reducible to speech, and he develops all kinds of theories for how to deal with the transference, how to confront it, and so on. It's not easy. It's like, I think what he's saying here is interesting. As I understand it, what he's saying here is that we should not delude ourselves to think that transference is somehow immune from this structure entering into a relationship. It still does, right? Okay. So what does that have to do with inside and outside? The fact that these terms are present right from the outset in Freud's work doesn't mean that we shouldn't investigate them as stringently as possible. See, yes. Okay, what seminar is that?
That's no, that's Freud. That's from Instincts.
Oh, that's Freud. Is
Yeah.
it Instincts and the vicissitudes essay?
Yep.
Is it?
Yeah, I have it right here. What you call it? This was the paragraph really that kind of was singing. I'll read it quickly. Let us imagine ourselves in the situation of an almost entirely helpless living organism, as yet unoriented in the world, which is receiving stimuli in its nervous substance. This organism will very soon be in a position to make a first distinction and a first orientation. On the one hand, it will be aware of stimuli which can be avoided by muscular action, flight. These it ascribes to an external world. On the other hand, it will also be aware of stimuli against which such action is of no avail and whose character of constant pressure persists in spite of it. These stimuli are the signs of an internal world, the evidence of instinctual needs. The perceptual substance of the living organism will thus have found in the efficacy of its muscular activity a basis for distinguishing between an outside and an inside. So it seems as though satisfaction and need are what those things are turning on. But yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. The fact that these terms are present right from the outset, inside and outside, in Freud's work doesn't mean that we shouldn't investigate them as stringently as possible. And that's the section Connor just read. If we don't investigate them, we risk producing the kinds of deviations that stop us from perceiving what an analytic experience feeds the belief in the subject's supposed to know, or at least converges on it. As long as the subject's supposed to know before we know is not seriously called into question, we can say that our entire approach will remain bogged down in a form of resistance, in a mindset that doesn't detach from it. Since a flawed conception of the ground on which we raise questions inevitably induces distortion at the theoretical level. When we consider the use analysts make all the time, not simply day after day, but every minute, of the term projection and introjection, how can these terms not have, if they are not correctly critiqued, an inhabiting effect on analysts' own thinking, and worse still, a suggestive effect in their interpretations, in a way which, it is not excessive to say so, can only be cretinizing? An inside and an outside seem self-evident if we consider an organism, namely an individual that in fact truly exists. The inside is what is within its skin. The outside is everything else. To conclude that what he imagines about the outside must also be inside his skin seems, at first glance, to be modest and a self-evident step. That is precisely what Bishop Berkeley bases his claims on. Regarding what is outside, you know, after all, only what is inside your own head. Consequently, it will, in any case, always be a representation. Whatever you say about the world, I can always comment that it is based on how you picture it. It is truly odd that at a certain moment in history, such an image was able to prevail to so great an extent that a discourse that could in fact be refuted, at least in a certain context, could rely on it. That of a representation designed to sustain this idea of representation. The secret core of what is known as idealism consists in the final analysis in the representation that gives such an advantage to representation. It is certainly striking that by simply broaching it as I am, the veil, so to speak, begins to quiver. If it is so simple, people say to themselves, how could people have even dwelt on it? To foster this quivering, we must now show how this mirage-like representation is constructed. And I will do so in other words. I will imagine it for you. Nothing could be simpler. We need not even resort to Aristotle's little treatise on sense and the sensible, which is a rather striking text all the same, to perceive that, given the way in which he approaches the eye and the way he intends to account for vision, he does not have at his disposal something that is second nature to us, namely, the most elementary optical apparatus, the camera obscura. Would somebody mind starting to read here at Let Me Take the Opportunity paragraph? Anybody can jump in as they wish.
Let me take the opportunity to say how advantageous it would be if someone would do a study on optics in ancient science. That science went very far, much further than people think, in all sorts of areas related to mechanics. But it seems clear that, as regards optics, strictly speaking, it had a remarkable blind spot. The model that marked the era of representation in which the core of idealism crystallized is as simple as anything. Do you mind scrolling? Okay, thanks. It is that of the camera obscura, namely a closed, unlit space in which a little hole opens out onto the world outside. If there is a light inside the world, its image appears and moves on the inside wall of the camera obscura as a function of what happens outside. It is extremely striking to see what was articulated at a certain moment in science by the finest of minds, that of Isaac Newton, who, as you know, broke as much ground in optics as in gravitation. It is no accident that, at the time, he was, let me remind you, said by his contemporaries to be equal to God's designs, which he was able to decipher. I'm saying this to confirm the remark that I made earlier regarding the theological envelope surrounding the first steps of our science. Optics is essential to imagining the subject as something that is on the inside. One might even claim that the function of the subject is modeled on the camera obscura. It is quite astonishing that it seemed to be acceptable that it is of no importance where we locate the little hole on which the sight of the image depends. Wherever it is placed, an image will be produced across from it in the camera obscura. It is only from the side in which the little hole is located that we see the world, that is, what is outside, and what is no longer anything but an image since it is translated as a mere image inside. This apparatus seems to imply that anything outside, in a space that nothing limits, can in theory come to occupy a place inside the room. It is nevertheless clear that if we make multiple holes, there will no longer be any image at all. I won't dwell on this topic for very long, for that is not what is most germane for us. I will confine myself to remarking that it is there and there alone that the notion that what concerns the psyche must be situated on the inside of something that is limited by a surface, finds support. A surface, of course, we are told. Freud already talked about a surface turned toward the outside, and we thus localize the subject on that surface. The subject is, as they say, defenseless against what is inside. As representation cannot be placed elsewhere, we put them there, and we put everything else there too, namely what are known variously and confusedly as affects, instincts, and drives. All of that is situated on the inside. But why are we so concerned with knowing the relationship between a reality and its locus, whether inside or outside? We would do well to first investigate what it becomes as reality, or qual-reality. We should perhaps begin to detach ourselves from the fascinating fact that we cannot imagine. I'm sorry, let me start over that paragraph. We should perhaps begin to detach ourselves from the fascinating fact that we can't imagine. Could you scroll down just a tiny bit more? Oh, thanks. Okay. We should perhaps begin to detach ourselves from the fascinating fact that we cannot imagine a living being's representation or thinking being anywhere except inside its body. That's kind of a crazy quote. Okay.
Sorry, can we repeat this? it's a very elusive sentence. We should perhaps begin to detach ourselves from the fascinating fact that we cannot imagine a living being's representation or thinking being anywhere except inside its body. So here he is in kind of full solidarity with the Bishop Berkeley. Okay.
Should we continue reading or comment?
No, please. I mean, people have comments; they can just raise their hands as they wish. But I'm following along.
Reading.
Yeah, please.
Okay, 2. Let us leave that fascination behind for a moment and ask ourselves what happens regarding the inside and the outside when what is at issue is, for example, a commodity. We have heard often enough about the nature of commodities to know that we must distinguish between their use value and their exchange value. We tell ourselves that exchange value is obviously what happens outside. But let us put our commodity in a warehouse. The latter too must exist. A warehouse is an inside. It is where we keep and store the commodity. When casks of oil are outside of the warehouse, they are exchanged and then they are consumed. Use value. It is rather odd that it is when they are inside that they are reduced to their exchange value. In a warehouse, by definition, we don't destroy or consume them, but rather preserve them. Use value is prohibited on the inside, where we would expect it, and the only thing that subsists there is exchange value. What is most enigmatic is when we are no longer talking about commodities, but rather about the fetish of fetishes, money. In that case, what value does this thing, which has no use value, but only exchange value, have when it is in the safe? It is quite obvious that people put it there and keep it there. What is this inside that seems to render completely enigmatic what is locked away there? Isn't it, in its own way, with respect to what constitutes the essence of money, an inside that is altogether outside of what constitutes the essence of money? I'm making these remarks merely in order to broach the status of thought. Thought, too, has some connection with exchange value. In other words, it circulates. To those who have not yet understood that a thought can only be conceptualized, strictly speaking, by being articulated, by being inscribed in language, and by being able to be sustained under conditions of what is known as the dialectic, which means a certain play of logic with rules, these simple remarks should suffice to raise a question, like the one I raised a moment ago regarding money placed in a safe. What does it mean when we keep a thought to ourselves? If we do not know what it is when we keep it to ourselves, its essence must thus lie elsewhere. In other words, already outside, without us having to engage in projection to say that the thought wanders about out there. Otherwise stated, we should realize that something which was not immediately apparent to everyone. However convincing Berkeley's argument may be, it is certainly possible that what constitutes its strength is an intuition based on a model that suggests that representations can only be on the inside. But the fact that we allow ourselves to be duped by yet another image, and especially an image that depends on a certain state of technology, is not what is important here. What is important is that the argument in question is in fact irrefutable. In order for idealism to hold up, there must be not only Bishop Berkeley, but a few other people with whom he can have a debate about whether we have an apprehension of the world that merely defines the philosophical limits of idealism. It is to the degree to which, in discourse, we can't get out of it, we have nothing to retort, that it is irrefutable. Regarding the topic of idealism and realism, there are obviously those who are right and those who are wrong. Those who are right are in reality. I'm speaking from the standpoint of realists. See R in the figure. Where are those who are wrong? They too have to be located on the schema. What is important is that at the level of the debate, of the articulable discussion, at the point at which the philosophical discussion had arrived at the time, Berkeley was right, even even though it was obvious that he is wrong. This is what I will refer to as Berkeley's schema. It is based on the principle of the camera obscura, represented by the circle. Inside, I have placed the subject of representation. Reality is distinguished from it by simply being outside, as if it were self-evident that everything that is outside of it is real. This demonstrates that this first sketch of the field of objectivity is false. If this is true, we must then provide a different sketch. And how can we do so? What happens to the inside and the outside? Could someone else start reading? I'm losing my footsteps.
No, thank you very much.
Um,
Really great.
Read if there's a volunteer. That's it. Go ahead.
Oh, no. It's I just wanted to just check in, make sure everybody's clear on all of this. I think the point about thought and the point about use value and exchange value is interesting because as I understand it, it is illogical or counterintuitive that the commodity in the warehouse would itself, you could see quite logically that it would already possess a sort of, let's call it like intrinsic or substantive use value, right? But I think Marx adds the proviso or the twist that it's only through the exchange of commodities in which you have both use value and exchange value that is produced, but in capitalism, that value is subordinated to exchange value. And then I was a little bit less clear about his example of thought, but I suppose it's coming into some clarity for me. Others have any thoughts about this? He's sort of trying to upend our assumptions regarding how these logics of inside outside function. It's actually quite interesting.
I mean, connections kind of Hegelian in the sense that he's saying that both thought and money are concrete abstractions, which is to say that they're concrete processes of abstraction in the world. And like, I'm sorry, but I forgot what the other part of the question was.
Oh no, I was just asking for clarification that people are following along with this thing. Oh, the other example, of course, was money itself.
Right,
Money in a
sorry,
safe.
no, but the thing with thought is that he's saying is that it's not just in your head. It's because there's an unconscious, you see thought play out in society. And in that sense, it's also a concrete abstraction that isn't bounded in the body, right? Like the unconscious is like how the body is cathected by the social and by the superego. And sorry, I don't mean to do this stuttering approach.
No, I understand. Yeah, it's right. I mean, it's true that Berkeley is sort of. I can see the point as to why he's both correct but also wrong. Precisely because idealism develops a representation of representation. But he's right that the origin of representation would come from, let's say, like subjectively or from.
No, I think he's saying Berkeley is completely wrong, but that there was a particular point at which the state of discourse was such that no one could say Berkeley was wrong. And that's why discourse at that point was fucked. Right? Like I think that's his and like later on he'll go to say that, what did the common man do during the time of Berkeley? They ignored philosophy because that was the rational thing to do, right? Like when confronted with arguments such as this. I think he's saying Berkeley is completely
wrong. Yeah, well, possibly. I'm not sure. We can revisit that, but let's hear from Luis and then Connor.
So what I am stuck here is when he talks about the fetish of fetishes, money, right? And how is that related to how you can, some people think that you can keep your money in a safe, right? In the same way you can keep your thoughts safe. So what is going on here? Like the fact that you can believe that your thoughts are being, you can repress a thoughts, like you can keep a thought safe. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Connor, please.
Yeah, I'm not, you know, this, I'm still trying to like work through this in my own head, but it's just interesting how he's talking about commodities as something that are being like stored and preserved within warehouses, while at the same time it seems as though, you know, it seems as though like the important thing about commodities is that they can be exchanged for any other commodity. And so far as that's exactly what exchange value is about. It's about substitution, right? So like you can substitute the same amount of energy or quantifiable uh a commodity measure for the same amount of money, right? But at the same time, it seems as though these commodities are not being exchanged; they're being preserved. So there seems as though like there's two things like going on there. I'm not sure where this is going, and intuitively speaking, it seems as though it has something to do with like the drives, right? Like the bad thing for both the body and capitalism is when things stop circulating, right? So yeah, I'm kind of just thinking out loud. I'm not sure how this all ties together, but
No, it's a good point. Yeah. It's sort of in motion. The whole argument's in motion. So we're sort of intervening perhaps a little bit early. But let's hear from Matilda and then from Noah.
Yeah, it for sure pivots quite a bit in those last few paragraphs. I feel like maybe he got to the point about money so that he could talk about the thought, and I think he's trying to persuade us that we should begin to stop thinking about thought inside the body. I mean, he says before he kind of goes into it, that we should begin to detach ourselves from the fact that we cannot imagine representation except in the body, that we have to move away from that, maybe bias or something. And that's what he accomplishes with the pivot to money, this similarity to thought. Like when thought is on the inside, it's actually anywhere, or it's not actually like confined to a localized position, perhaps, something like that. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Noah, how's it going?
Good, good. So mentioning back to the inside and the outside, and then I think someone might have mentioned like the Hegelness of that idea, or because I'm trying to go through the phenomenology of spirit right now, and this thing about an object and what we invest into the symbolism of that object. I think Todd McGowan might have mentioned this in like a talk, but he talked about something about collectors and how like they'll collect valuables because of the like it's kind of like the psychic investment that they're putting into these objects that allow them to have some sort of like jouissance or enjoyment out of these objects. So it sounds like with the paragraph that says the fetish of fetishes and money, it's like I don't know if that's he's using this like illustration of money as like holding on to this object within a safe gives us a type of enjoyment that allows us to fantasize this object of money. And if we take that into like the idea of thought, is that is that maybe it becomes like a libidinal investment into the thoughts that we have, like every like psychic symbolism that appears within the mind, and how we invest in those symbols within our thoughts, we get a type of like jouissance out of that. And but then when it comes to this this thing about jouissance, and like, and it becomes an excess of pleasure where it becomes like a painful pleasure, like psychically. So I would say, maybe to use the idea of God, or religion, is that this object, this God object within our mind that we invest everything into, like our entire like being, we libidinally invest everything into this God object, and we enjoy that we possess this God object within our thought. So it can become a problem when we're not able to take like the money out of the safe. Like, the money has to be used. It has to be disposed of. It has to be it has to be what is that word called? Discarded, or it has to be, I don't know, in a lack of better words, like kind of shit out, to be honest. Because that's essentially what it is that these investments can become so torrential because we're so attached to the thought image. We invest ourselves into the thought image. We're not able to bring it outside, but it has to come outside in order for it to evaporate. So I don't know if that makes like any sort of like sense, but it's like that whole thing when what Lacan says about love. It's like when the moment you say love, it's not love anymore. And so, like, the moment you say I love you, suddenly it's no longer love, because the enunciation was an object, a phantasmatic object that we let out through enunciation, which wasn't able to totalize the word in itself, which allowed it to evaporate. I don't know. I mean, sorry, just trying to riff off of it.
No, it's true. I mean, it's the logic of exchange value is homologous or pretty much identical to how we find ourselves alienated in language, and this is most evident when we're subordinated to having to speak whatever comes to our mind. All sorts of new barriers appear before us, and the subject's supposed to know, and the ascription of a godlike status to others can freeze us and make our speech quite rigid in a certain way. Yeah, like one nice description of what psychoanalysis can do is actually loosen the rigidity of our speech in a certain way. So I think that all of those things you're saying are at play here. But we're focusing specifically on this notion of Berkeley developing a point of a theory of the subject from the point of the camera obscura, which is a point of perception which is uniquely located, a point of perception on reality which is objective, but also uniquely located inside the subject, right? And Lacan is basically saying that both the discourse on science and yeah, discourse as such, a reality of having to speak to others and so on, disrupts Berkeley's it disrupts his concepts. But let's find out why, because here we are at 18.1. Luis, very quickly first, and then we'll go back to the text.
Yeah, so some ideas I was thinking. So in repression, right? The subject represses, yet there is no repression in the unconscious, right? On the outside, on the other. So maybe we can think that we repress an idea we don't know, certain idea, right? A thought, because its essence lies elsewhere. But there is an unconscious, there is this other that is full, we believe, right? Like there is the subject supposed to know God, that where these thoughts or value exists. I think so, like this outside.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, that reminds me of this theory of real abstraction from the Marxist philosopher Alfred's son Rachel, in his theory of how commodity exchange also produces the preconditions for things like abstract thought, and eventually for things like the possibility of rationalism, and then later in Kant of this idea of a form of knowledge which would be a priori or fundamentally true but outside of experience, right? So all of that theory of exchange is super huge. And the best thinker on this, by the way, if you really want to analyze this, of course, is Koji Karatani in his work Modes of Exchange. And by the way, of course, Karatani unfortunately has like dozens and dozens of essays on Jacques Lacan that are not translated into English, unfortunately. But I would absolutely love to read what Karatani has to say about this. Okay, I guess I can read here. We are here. This is what I will refer to as Berkeley's schema. Is that right? Is that where we are?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it's based on the principle of the camera obscura, represented by the circle. Inside, I've placed the subject of representation, S small r. Reality is distinguished from it by simply being outside, as if it were self-evident that everything that is outside of it is real. This demonstrates that this first sketch of the field of objectivity is false. If this is true, must we then provide a different sketch of it? And how can we do so? What happens to the inside and the outside? We're clearly forced to redraw the schema, for we find ourselves at the limit or midpoint between the symbolic and the imaginary. And because our cogitations require at least some intuitive prop, but doesn't that mean that we must radically abandon the terms projection and introjection in psychoanalytic intervention? Terms that we use constantly without providing the slightest critique of Berkeley's schema? Another probably very unfortunate apprehension of things involves failing to distinguish in everything that is constructed outside different orders of reality. To realize this, it suffices to raise. So by the way, this whole, you guys know the concept of introjection is absolutely essential for like the Kleinian school, right? In this notion of transitional object. They are big on this concept, and what he's saying here is interesting because he's basically saying that the logic of introjection psychoanalysts have not plumbed or confronted its own basis in idealism. Okay. The question of what this edifice owes, to realize this, it suffices to raise the question of what this edifice owes to an order that is not necessarily reality at all, since it is our own fabrication. This is what we should investigate, since we must intervene in the field of something that is known as the unconscious, which is not at all, as opposed to what people say, a field of elemental, organic, carnal facts, or biological stirrings. The unconscious is articulable. It is intellectual in nature, even if it is inescapably articulated in words. The radical nature of what is at the basis, not of what I am teaching, but of what I need, but recognize in our everyday practice and in Freud's work, raises a question about the status of the inside and the outside, and about the way we should conceptualize what must correspond to those facts that are always so awkwardly handled using the terms introjection and projection. It is anecdotally quite frustrating how popular those terms, especially projection, is. Is it not true that every time you have a disagreement with a loved one, people will throw around this concept of projection in ways that are like so detethered from any like basis of sense? That's my experience, at least. With multiple partners, I must add. Nobody has any discipline when it comes to what they mean by projection. Am I wrong? Maybe somebody out there is precise about it, but I haven't met them in my life. I'll put it that way. Things go so far that when Freud initially defines the ego, he himself dares to articulate things by saying that, starting from a certain state of confusion with the world, the psyche separates into an inside and outside. Yet nothing in his discourse indicates whether this outside is identifiable with the indeterminate space that it is identified with in everyday view of it, or whether this inside is the same as something that we now consider to establish a requirement of the organism, all of whose components we are going to look for inside. Okay. Okay. The reference to the text there, by the way, is what? I'm not sure. From Freud. Connor, do you think it's the one from the one that you read a moment ago?
I think it's highly possible.
Could be.
I'm thinking especially of this from Freud. A better term for an instinctual stimulus is a need. I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't find it right now, but it's in this like it's in here that Freud talks about affects, needs, satisfaction, like all as if they're interchangeable. But with that, like that choice of word to establish the requirement of the organism seems really deliberate from Lacan. So he's just like evoking it, but he's trying not to evoke it either, it seems to be. So
yeah. Right.
You see what I mean?
I do. Yeah, I do. Yeah. Well, there is that whole concept of trauma from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which also entails the concept of inside, outside, vis-a-vis this notion of the border and crossing of the border, which is present in Freud as well. But Lacan is not invoking this concept of border, so we don't need to visit it. But he is basically helping apply the imaginary and the symbolic to 18.1 in Berkeley's schema, by the way, which makes some sense. Yes, Noah.
So with he's talking about an actual, like with the camera obscura, is he like actually talking about like a camera? Like it's just a normal camera, right? Like
Not exactly. No, it's more like a point at which one derives the determination of what is real. And it's like anyways, something that you can look it up and see various examples of it. But
okay.
it's yeah, it's like a privileged point that like a keyhole onto something that can give us knowledge about the total reality of in front of us or something like that. So it's like,
It's sort of not it's just it's a pinhole camera. So it just means like, and you can construct that by just, you take a piece of cardboard and you put a hole in it.
yeah,
And so it's like the opposite of a privilege point. Like he's kind of going like, oh, it doesn't even matter where you make the point. It's just that there
Yeah.
is a point, you know. And from there, like all the light would flood in. And now you might think like, oh, that just means like there's not enough room for all of the light. Let me make multiple holes. But if you do that, then there's no image. Right? Because the single hole was the condition of the image. Two holes means there's interference with the image. More holes means there's no image. Right? So,
that's helpful. Yes.
So the mistake is that, oh, yeah. Anyway.
So I'm just kind of wondering, if I were to take the word camera literally, like an actual camera takes a photograph, the photograph comes out, the photograph itself is an object, and this object has inside of it another object, say it's a car, and the only reason that photograph, the only reason why that car looks so special is because it's within the frame of the photograph. But if you were to take away the frame and see the entire scape that the car is immersed in, suddenly the appeal of the car vanishes because you see too much of the scape that it's submerged in. So it kind of sounds like with an object that has maybe the object A within it, it is the frame. Like, objects are a frame that have an object within it that gives it its value. I mean, that's just kind of what I would think, because I've messed with cameras that I don't really know a lot, but what makes an object so valuable within a frame is that it is in a frame, period. It doesn't make it so special when it's not inside of a frame. Is the only thing that I can kind of draw out of that, which would make sense to me when it comes to the object A and an object. And if you remove the frame into the entire context, then it loses its appeal.
Yeah, that's very interesting reflections, Noah. Thank you for that. I think Matan, please, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing to point out regarding the difference between like a regular camera and the camera obscura was that in order to kind of capture the image permanently, you'd have to you would have to physically like trace it out, right? And what's interesting, I've done a little bit of research on this, is that as lens were just getting I don't know, up and running in Europe, the church actually kind of as an act of censorship, they limited it quite heavily. And so up until then, you just had like a camera obscura, you had like these like merchants doing it for private individuals for a high cost or whatever. But it's interesting enough, once it was censored, it was only after that the lenses were censored that the system of linear perspective started really being developed. Interestingly enough, even though it was developed from these reflections, insofar as it is like a valid system, and it was done so in the act of tracing it very quickly, and not just tracing, but also kind of having to adjust for like little errors and things like that in the whole. And so it's an act of like, it's in terms of having an eye for the finished product that these sort of like little kind of systems, I suppose you could say, emerged that had something to do with like a mathematical order that is kind of like maybe perfect, but also completely non-correlative to our experience. And so it's interesting how the act of experience, and particularly that of censorship, brought about its there's a lot more to say about this, and if you wish to read about it, the painter David Hockney, he did a lot of research on this, and he has a book about it. But yeah.
What about censorship, did you say?
Also, it's interesting that the system of linear perspective, insofar as it was like stylistically like incorporated into paintings very heavily, especially with like painters of the church who had to some degree, like maybe they had a buddy in the church who had access to lenses or something like that. And so they were able to kind of develop the system of linear perspective, of which kind of the public, the classes who would view paintings would then kind of like ascribe to them a sort of a very intense sort of like image of mastery, whereas what they were doing was rather, I wouldn't say simple, but it was like really experimental. And over time they would kind of like learn these little tricks for composing the images, and it had to do with like the development of linear perspective specifically, which again is interesting insofar as it provides like a vanishing point, we can say, which is at the same time kind of like a perfect representation of everything, insofar as it accords with like a certain mathematical harmony, a mechanistic harmony, but at the same time it does so at the cost of like any there's effects of immediacy, but in doing that, in representing it, we have this whole Adornian negative dialectics going on. But anyways, the main point was just to kind of connect this back to the last chapter of or seminar or whatever, Thought is Censorship, and try to connect this back to George Berkeley, where I think the point where kind of he disagrees with Berkeley is the point at which this sort of reasoning becomes a way of deferring something else, I suppose. I would say that the time that I employ this sort of reasoning of Berkeley is when I'm like losing at poker or something like that. I'm like, oh, nothing really matters, or just whatever I can do to kind of like come up with a situation in which what I'm doing is rational, or that my like little rationalizations mean something.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I want to learn more about camera obscura from you, but I think we have somewhat limited time. Luis, and then we'll get back.
Well, yeah, some interesting facts. So Roland Barthes has a book called Camera Lucida, which is about a different device, right? Well, I'm not going to explain it, but the interesting fact is that in this device, you kind of see the shadow and you draw it, and which makes Barthes think about how the picture, there is this kind of punctum of subjectivity, right? And instead, the camera lucida doesn't show, exposes this subjectivity as the camera oscura doesn't show the subjectivity as the camera lucida does, right? The camera oscura kind of portrays an objective point of view. And I think that's what is this privileged point of view that is objective, in contrast to the camera lucida that shows a kind of subjective trace, from which then Barthes says that, photography, then he talks about photography has this very subjective point of view in which the photographer takes a picture, right? It's not just an objective picture, but it's the subjective, desire of the photographer that takes that picture, right?
Yeah, thank you. Would somebody like to read, perhaps starting here at 3 down? Yeah. Would that be all right? We can already take an additional step.
We can already take an additional step forward by demonstrating what is unthinkable about the schema of the camera obscura, figure 18.1. We need but return to Aristotle to realize that, owing to the fact that he does not refer to a camera obscura, the questions that arise for him are completely different from those that arise for us, and that his conception renders unthinkable, strictly speaking, any conception of the nervous system, for example. Read the first few chapters of the little treatise entitled On Sense and the Sensible, for that text is quite provocative. It already touches on the question which led to so many subsequent discussions, whether there is something in vision that opens out onto reflection. Paul Valéry's Seeing Oneself, See Oneself, and Lejeune Park is broached by Aristotle, and in the funniest way, oh, you know what, pardon me, I got the little parentheticals wrong, but anyways, and in the funniest way imaginable via the fact that when you push on an eye, phosphenes result, in other words, something that resembles light. It is for that reason alone that he feels we can state that the eye that sees also sees itself, that sees also sees itself, in some sense, since it produces light when we press on it. Many other things in his treatise are provocative. For example, the formulations he arrives at that make the translucent dimension of things essential when accounting for the fact that the eye sees on the basis of one thing and one thing alone. It represents an especially well-suited apparatus in the translucent realm. It is not the case that what we have here is something that in any way resembles an inside and an outside, but rather that the eye sees because it shares an equality that I would call visionary, which is not all that dumb. We have here a certain way of thrusting the subject into the world. The question has undoubtedly become a bit different for us. The 1,000 other theories stated at his time, which Aristotle had to argue against, all in some way involved something that we have no trouble finding anew in our images, including that of projection. For, I ask you, what does the term projection presuppose when it involves no longer what is seen or what sees itself, but the imaginary, a certain affective configuration with which we assume that our patients modify the world at certain moments? What is this type of projection, if not the assumption that the light beam that illuminates the world comes from an inside, just as in antiquity certain people imagined rays that radiated out from the eye to light up the world and objects, however enigmatic this shining vision was. Our metaphors suggest that we might still be at that point. What is not the least marvelous about this text by Aristotle is the fact that it allows us to put our finger on not so much what he himself establishes as on all those he refers to, Empedocles, for example, who claims that the eyes have something in common with fire, to which Aristotle retorts by appealing to a different element, water. Let me incidentally indicate that it bothers him that there are only 4 elements, as he explicitly says there are 5 senses and it thus seems hard to correlate them. He finesses things by unifying taste and touch, since they are both related to earth, but enough joking. There's nothing especially funny about these things in and of themselves, yet they are exemplary. If we read the texts, which, however superficial they may seem to us, were not written by stupid people, to simply immerse ourselves, as it were, in what animates them, we see something that localizes the field of vision for us, assuming we have reanimated it, so to speak, owing to what we have placed in it by inserting it into desire via perversion. Otherwise stated, the mainspring of the function of object A in the visual field is suggested to us there, assuming we have already practiced using it to some degree. There's a figure 18.2, object A between outside other and inside subject. In the visual field, object A is related with respect to objective structure to the function of a third term. And it is striking that ancient thinkers literally did not know what to do with it. They miss it, and yet it is the biggest thing going on. They, too, find themselves caught between 2 things, sensation, in other words, the subject, and the world that is sensed. They have to rouse themselves, as it were, in order to introduce light as a third term, the light source, quite simply insofar as its rays reflect off objects and form an image for us inside the camera obscura. Then what? After that, we have this marvelous nonsense about the synthesis carried out by consciousness, which is located somewhere, and it seems particularly conceivable, owing solely to the fact that we can situate it in folds of the brain. Why would an image suddenly become synthetic because it is in a brain rather than on a retina? The concept of object A is sufficiently suggested by the hesitant steps that were taken throughout the tradition, which showed that ancient thinkers quite clearly realized that the solution to the problem of vision was not simply light. Light is a precondition, of course, In order for us to see something, it must be light out. But how does that explain the fact that we see? Object A in the sculptophilic field, if we try to translate it at the level of aesthesia, sensitiveness, is quite precisely a blank or black spot, as you like, something that is missing behind the image, so to speak, and which, by a purely logomachic effect of synthesis, we situate so easily somewhere in the brain. It is quite precisely insofar as something is missing in what presents itself as an image that we find the mainspring for which there is only one solution, object A. In other words, precisely as lack and, if you will, as spot. By definition, a spot is something that presents itself in the field as a whole or absence. We know from zoology that in lamellar beings, the little optical apparatus, which is so well constructed and fills us with wonder, with such wonder, known as an eye, first takes the form of a spot. Do we consider it to be purely and simply an effect? Light produces spots, that is clear enough, but we are no longer at that stage. Ancient thinkers could not do otherwise than situate spots as essential and structuring in all vision, then situate them as the place of lack, as the place of the third term in the field rendered objective, or in the place of light, and that was their blunder. But it is not a blunder if we realize that this metaphorical effect, the effect of the metaphor of a point negated in the field of vision, must not be chalked up to a deployment that is more or less illusory. It is instead something that ties a subject to this field, a subject whose knowledge is entirely determined by a more radical and essential lack that concerns him as sexual being. This is what shows how the field of vision is inserted into desire. Why, after all, can't we admit the following? That all of what makes it such that there is viewing or contemplation, visual relations that interest speaking beings, the reason why is connected to and finds its roots solely at the level of what, because it is a spot in the field, can serve to plug up lack, completely articulated lack, lack that is articulated as lack, namely, the only term thanks to which speaking beings can situate themselves as belonging to one sex or another. It is at the level of object A that we can conceptualize the articulable division of the subject into a subject who is wrong because he is right. That's Bishop Berkeley for you. And another subject who, doubting that thought is worth anything, in reality proves that thought is in and of itself censorship, pardon me. It is important to situate the gaze as subjective because it does not see. This is what renders thinkable the fact that thought itself is based on the following and on the following alone, that it is censorship. We can thereby metaphorically articulate thought itself as constituting a spot in logical discourse.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Very nice. Any thoughts emerge from that? Yes, we do have some. Sorry, Noah and then Louise.
So I'm just trying to run with the object within the frame. So the object within the frame is the object of desire. And that object, it sounds like when he says, by definition, a spot, by definition, a spot is something that presents itself in the field as a whole or absence. So if I have a picture of a loved one, that is the I don't know what that may be the love object, and that object is the whole in which I place my desire into. So I'm just kind of wondering if that kind of goes along the lines with object A as well. I don't know. I'm just trying to play with the idea of what this whole or absence is when we look at an object of our, like, when we look at an object, we insert our desire onto it or into it because it is a whole that allows us to do so. or draws us to do so.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's that formulaic or that tight of a claim about object A famously as the object of desire. I think that's true, but I think the point at which Lacan is speaking here is slightly different in regards to a point within the perception of a field of vision that the ancients were not able to access. Like it's this kind of like distinct modern point of like the example from the ambassadors painting of like the void point or the absent point is how we're thinking about this, which is I think is something obviously that was not available to Berkeley, right? So it's like the yeah, I don't know, like I see your logic of where you're trying to take this and how you're trying to conceptualize it, Noah, but at the same time I'm not sure that that metaphor is most applicable for what we're trying to figure out in this instance, because in this instance Lacan is talking about the constitution of reality as a necessitating this point of absence that appears within reality. It's quite elusive. It's related to thought as well, because the point of thought coming out of Freud as a point of the unconscious is something that always marks thought with a point of the falsity or with error or like at a constitutive level, right? So that point of negativity remains and is constitutive in reality. That's the object A in this instance. Others are invited. Luis, perhaps you might articulate this as well.
Yeah, so Sloterdijk has a very interesting book about architecture where he talks about light, and well, it explains how the Enlightenment, right, was this movement about bringing light to the world, right, bringing this knowledge that that will enlighten the world, right? So already with Enlightenment we have this notion of bringing light to the world, making everything visible, knowledge visible, right? Which presupposes these subjects supposed to know, right? And Lacan, I think this is how the Venn diagrams that I was showing to you shows here, is that we have A and S, the other and the subject, but the A, right, the little a, is a lack. It's not like there is intersection between A and between the other and the subject. No, there is a lack that is what unites the two of them. Like the other is lacking, the subject is lacking, right? And there we have this lack in the middle that cannot be fulfilled, right? And this is why I think he talks about perversion. I think this goes back to the discussion I had with Akshay, right? The pervert, in this case of the Enlightenment, we can also see perversion with Enlightenment, tries to embody the gaze, right? And tries to be the gaze of this objective world. So it's always connected to this, external world, objective knowledge that the pervert presupposes that he knows, right? And I think that's how it connects, this notion of the gaze and the objective world.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. What does the pervert do with the object A is interesting as well, because they put the object A to work. Like they want to fill it, they want to cover it over, right? They need to find a solution to it, right? Was this not Pascal's notion of beginning the wager with a primitive understanding of this absence or lack? So it's also like yeah, because the pervert is the one who is like the old-fashioned believer, right? Connor?
Yeah. So I kind of just wanted to return to like the very last paragraph of section 2.
Okay.
Things go so far that when Freud initially defines the ego, so we're talking about the ego, he himself dares to articulate things by saying that starting from a certain state of confusion with the world, the psyche separates into an inside and an outside. So why is he talking about Aristotle, right? Well, that's what he's referring to, this initial state of confusion. But I think one of the reasons why he's talking about Aristotle, because it seems as though for them, like, it seems as though there was no separation at first, but then problems come up. And yeah, I mean, it's always helpful to return to like just very basic questions, but it seems as though like what's really at issue is this reconciliation, or the possibility of reconciliation between this inside and this outside world. And it seems as though this model of big A, small a, and S all overlapping, it looks to me like it's all coming together, right? But it seems though at the same time that we're not going to say that this is actually a reconciliation. To put this like more directly, you know, like, can we see things for what they are? You know, if this is like ideology critique, or are we always sort of mystified? You know, can we not, you know, is that not possible? You know, or are we always fated to be ideological? Right. So I'm not sure if like we're getting there towards an answer here. It seems though we may be, but I'm not picking up on it. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Please, Matilda.
I think Akshay had their hand up before I did.
Oh, okay. Please, Akshay, please. Those are the order it appeared. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I guess like I don't think Aristotle is the confusion of the world. I think that's this, you know, I don't know, sort of like being in the amniotic fluid, or sort of like the womb, or like, you know, sort of fantasy of oneness. But I mean, in the sense that with Aristotle, there's clearly like a subject and a world, right? Like the sensation and the world, but like what's given priority is the imagination, and the fact that the imagination is a medium through which any and all like conceptualization would have to happen. And I think that, you know, to Connor's question, I think that's the position he's sort of ending at, like that. I mean, yeah, of course you'd need to, or like this sort of Althuserian, like, of course we need an ideology, because the you know, like there's no such thing as not having an ideology, right? Like in that sense of like not having sort of an axiomatic set of I don't know, claims about how you interpret reality, like in some sense. So, right.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes. Matilda, please.
Just thinking about the whole section of 3 in a way, and it seems like maybe there's something dissatisfying about Berkeley's perspective from a Freudian perspective. Of course, there's like it seems like we're in some sense like trying to insert this visual field, which I took almost to be like maybe Berkeleyan idealism, and he says we're like inserting it into the drives, we're inserting the visual field into the drives or something. And like I'm thinking about like idealism really doesn't have an account of like organic repression or like human prematurity, like internal forces or something. And maybe that's like what's at stake here, or like what's the operation that's happening, or like that the visual field in fact was always dependent upon this this sexual situation underneath it or something. And that, I mean, I found it interesting, this paragraph, that why can't we admit the following? That all of what makes it such that there is viewing or contemplation, visual relations that interest speaking beings, is connected to and finds its roots solely at the level of what, because it is a spot in the field, can serve to plug up lack, completely articulate lack that is articulated as lack. Namely, the only term thanks to which speaking beings can constitute themselves as belonging to one sex or another. So it's like introducing like kind of desire into this idealism, perhaps, and that there's a reduction involved in some way, like that there's something difficult to admit in this, which seems to be some sort of theme in Freudianism, like the truths of Freudianism and like the reduction that it inflicts on human reality is actually very hard to bear, like hard to agree with or something. I don't know. That's what
I mean,
Yeah.
Please. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
No, I mean, I think this is like the earlier discussion we were having about the cardboard, the pinhole camera, the camera obscura, and like the fantasy of objective vision is that, oh, my eye just goes out and sees all of it. But then, like, but you know, subjectively speaking, of course, desire constitutes the gaze and what catches your attention. That, like, so I think Lacan is very much going like, oh, of course, it's not that objectivity. But sometimes I didn't read this as at all kind of a depressing, you know, there's an almost like a kind of, like I find the section 3 very poetic and beautiful in this, like, you know, the imagination literally like lights up the world. Like it's very similar to this, like, you know, like kind of Frederick Jameson, oh, you know, we can't imagine, all of our science fiction has become just apocalyptic because, you know, we can no longer sort of, that question of, I mean, you know, like, anyway, yeah. I don't know. I mean, in the sense that it is like, you know, any utopian project would, by definition, being like a social thing, have to be imagined. But that doesn't need to be like a bad thing. You know, it doesn't need to be a depressing, oh, that means we can never have revolution. It just means, yeah.
No, that's really helpful because I feel like one of the examples that I always am drawn to when trying to articulate what object A is that object A is in effect that is sort of a residue of what happens when we encounter otherness within our own speech and analysis, that there's something that like a shard that remains within, like it's almost like a that which cannot be reincorporated back into something that we take as a point of wholeness in our meaning or in our, like it's that which makes totality impossible as we try to conceptualize it. It's like that which makes our sense finite. That's the object A, as like there's always, almost like as a rule, a kind of fixity or a finitude that pre-structures our perception. On the one hand, in this, because he's talking about here perception, but there's another way of getting at object A in relationship to the relationship between like signifiers in speech, in discourse, and in analysis, and how it is like an effect off of that. So there's sort of all of these different valences of the object A. This one is very interesting because in this instance, what I understand it to be is how the mark of the unconscious comes to splatter, like a paint splatter, a point that limits the scope of our conception of reality, I guess you could say, because he goes on in the conclusion to talk about this as well. So it's kind of like that. It's kind of like object A is that which doesn't make this full grasp of totality possible in some way. It's one way to think about it. Go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, I'm reminded of something earlier in the session. He said, paraphrasing, like, is what's outside like merely everything that's just not inside, right? And I think object A is just what resists, right? Like what resists this reconciliation between the inside and the outside, which is in that way is a really interesting idea because it's not merely outside. It's not merely what presents itself immediately to consciousness, but rather what emerges when you try to act on that naive presentation of reality and trying to change it in such a way, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work because there's something about your own sorts of like desires and so on that do not make themselves apparent, but show up, right? Nonetheless, in a word, the return of the repressed might be one way to think about object A, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's very useful. It's like it's almost like Berkeley. Why is Berkeley like partially right and partially wrong? Well, in a sense, like Berkeley is kind of correct in the sense that he is saying that the spirit of the organ of perception, for which the camera obscura is kind of like a metaphor of that, I guess you could say, a certain way. It's not perfect. It's not godlike, right? And I think Lacan kind of agrees with that point, you know what I'm saying? Because that's almost what object A is in this valence really indicates to me. But yeah, go ahead, Luis.
So I was reading some stuff about from Lacan, and remember we were talking about we read about the montage, right? So I mean, maybe I'm the only idiot who didn't get it, but I found that he talks about that is the object A as a montage, like a film, like we can think about the objective world. There is, an empty gap, and there's a montage will be the gaze, right? Something that we can remove at any time, and we can place different objects. So this is the montage that maybe we can, if we apply to this in this context, we have the view of the world, yet we apply this montage, this fantasy, so we can have an objective perspective, right?
Exactly, but the gaze of the pervert, in a paradoxical sense, is more objective than the subjective perception of like what the non-perverse perception, because in the gaze of the pervert, they have they have fully subjectivized the other. They are seen like a perfect reflection of the other's reality, such that they don't no longer exist. Which is something that I think he says is correct in Sartre's section on the look in being and nothingness, right? About that point. Yeah, go ahead, Noah.
So I think it has potential to become godlike. Honestly, I think that with Instagram and like the selfie phenomenon, I mean,
yeah,
it's like the object within the frame is able to be gazed upon as godlike, like in a totality of what it is, without the to censor out with the frame the surrounding environment. Like the frame is the censor. Because I was thinking, like, when it comes to object A and a vessel that has its contents within it, we buy a jar of salsa, with its contents in it for the fact that it has its contents in it. But the real reason why we buy it is to empty it out of its contents, which is how we get our enjoyment out of the jar itself, is by emptying it out of its contents. So this object A is, in a way, a type of disappearance of the substance that is held within the vessel. I don't know. That's just kind of an idea that I'm playing with. I've heard it around. I've heard it around by other speakers, but I don't know.
That's helpful. No, that I think that works as a formula. I think that is congruent with how Lacan would mean it. I like that. Akshay, please, and then we'll read after this.
I mean, the entire next section is, I think, a return to perversion, which is quite striking. But I still, like, I think the Bishop Berkeley thing is very, I think he's kind of saying he's an idiot. Like, just because that sentence, like, what is it? A subject who is wrong because he is right. That's Bishop Berkeley for you. And another subject who doubting the thought is worth anything in reality proves the thought is in and of itself censorship. Like, I don't know about everyone else, but that reads to me like, quite the condemnation. But
it's a condemnation, sure, but I don't think that it's a full condemnation. I think that because there's something also he's also trying to say that there's whole discourses of psychoanalysis which are still kind of operating with this sort of Berkeleyan conception, is he not? Even in this reference to how people use introjection and projection and so on.
I think he's saying that, but I think he's saying that that's the insult. Like, there are still people using this, like, I mean, in the sense that, like, and that's, I think that's the why he's calling Cheswick-Way, Smuggle, and Grunberger cretins, right? Because
I do have a small point on this subject. There's, I think in the Freud event lesson, like, this needs to be kept in mind in some way, is he reviews the fact that, like, with Kant, and like it's kind of similar to Berkeley here, is that the whole philosophical tradition was like revolved around the relationship between a subject and something that remains entirely dependent on what appears, while excluding what lies behind it. And so he brings this up in the Freud event, but he goes on to say, and this is in the context of the pleasure principle and like the introduction of truth's fictional character, that from Freud's standpoint, in contrast, nothing about representation is tenable, except what, at a point that profoundly explains behavior, is linked to a structure that is made up of frameworks and networks located outside of the circuit of the subject, in whom representation is supposedly unified. And so, like, what he's doing with this comparing, like, this, like, both and thing of Berkeley and maybe Freud or something, is like, there's something about the accomplishment of the philosophical tradition and getting around the foundation of a relationship between a subject and something which is dependent on what appears, but that this representation isn't as stable for maybe Lacan or Freud. It's not like this reference point that can be maybe presupposed or something. Like, somehow there's also this thought as censorship. There is the pleasure principle as an interference between the stimulus reflex arc. It's it is a censorship, and so thought is connected to this, or this repression that is on a level that is not related to representation or something. but they still have, there's still an interface between the two or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's really nice. That's really nice. Yeah, that's really nice. While at the same time, Lacan is not comfortable to clearly locate the logic of censorship purely within the primordial drives of the body and like the this kind of vitalist things, he's rejecting that as well. Okay, let's read the rest here. After this rather long session, there's still something that I want to say, or at least broach it. I've arrived at the point of talking about perversion based on another way of inscribing the outside. The outside is not an infinitely open space to us where we situate just any old thing called reality. The outside we deal with is the other, and it has its own status. It is certainly not owing to the effort of psychoanalysts alone that we can currently explore its status on the basis of a purely logical investigation and articulate it as lacking. On the graph of desire, the sign large S barred large A, which represents the response given by the other with a capital O, at the end of what is posited in desiring enunciation, is quite precisely the gap or defect or flaw represented by desire. It's no accident that the terms here are manifested by little letters, that is, by an algebra. The very nature of an algebra is to allow for multiple interpretations. S barred A could mean all sorts of things, even the death of the father. But at a radical level, that of the logicization of our experience, S barred A is precisely what is known as structure, assuming that it's located somewhere and fully articulable. If my discourse can be characterized as structuralist, despite the reservations you know I have about such labels, it is because it demonstrates the relationship that exists between what permits us to establish a rigorous logic and, on the other hand, certain irreducible defects in articulation we see in the unconscious, from which the very effort attested to by the desire to know proceeds. As I told you, what I define as perversion is the returning in some primary sense or restoring of A to the field of A. That is rendered possible by the fact that small a is an effect of seizing something primitive or primordial. Why wouldn't we admit it on the condition that we not turn it into a subject? It is to the degree to which the animal being I mentioned earlier, with regard to its skin, is caught up in language, that something in him is turned into A, the A that is returned to the other, as it were. This is why when I mentioned perverts the other day, I ironically compared them to men of faith and even to crusaders. Perverts give God his true plenitude. Perversion is the structure of the subject in whom the reference to castration, namely the fact that women are distinguished by the fact that they don't have phalluses, is all plugged up, is masked, or it's filled in by the mysterious operation of object A. Perversion is a way of warding off the radical gap in the signifying order that castration represents. Basis and principle of perverse structure is to ward it off by supplying this other, insofar as it is asexual, with something that plugs up its lack of a phallus. If you will allow me to end today with a couple of play on words, I will return to a formulation I proffered here once before. Didn't I already designate the pervert's other with the term omel, or om, which means man, and el means she or she-man? And remember, by the way, from Fink, that the most common structure of perversion in the clinic is a child whose mother has a deficient sexual relationship to the father and has chosen the child, qua their penis, to stand in for the father, which is why the child avoids the father, but creates an alternative prop to the missing father function. And that's like, you know, their use of some alternative prop to make the father function work, but make it work without having to undergo castration, because that is something that has been that is the structure of disavow. That is why disavow is happening. I always thought that was helpful. Okay, she-man. It sounds picturesque, but it merely sounds that way, and it will help you get your bearings regarding the outside with respect to the play of the unconscious. As usual, I wasn't able to go as far as I'd hoped, but before leaving you today, I nevertheless want to point out to a path that leads from perversion to phobia, where I see the intermediary step that will finally allow us to authentically situate neurotics in the status of the inside and the outside for them. Why not write Omel by modifying S barred A in the sense that here it is on the basis of an A without any gap, without any failing or flaw, non-defalent, that we have the signifier of capital S. He's talking about for neurotics, right? Capital S, capital A provides the key to perversion. Isn't it conversely at the level of the signified of the gap that the division of A is found in neurotics? Namely, small s barred A, the signified of the barred other. This is of great topological interest, and it also shows that it is at the level of the enunciated that the text of the neurotic symptom is articulated. This explains why it's between the field of the ego, such that it is specularly organized, and that of desire, insofar as it's articulated with respect to the field dominated by object A, that the neurotic's fate is played out. We'll see this better next time using the old graph of desire. I'll be able to show you that the place of signifying barred A occupies in the neurotics game. I will take it up as regards phobia first, returning to something I already said regarding little Hans, but which was, I noticed, insufficiently conveyed in that seminar. To posit that the signified of A qua barred, marked by its logical failing, comes to be fully signified in the neurotic, clarifies for us what is inaugural in the neurotic's experience. The neurotic does not mask the conflictual articulation at the level of logic itself. The fact that thought fails in its very locus as a game with rules gives its true import to the distance that the neurotic himself takes from this in his experience. Go ahead, Luis, please.
So this all reminded me of in Zizek in Sex and the Field Absolute. He makes this reference when, you know, we are in seminar 16, but then in seminar 20, we have the logics of sexuation, the formulas of sexuation, right? Which allows a different perspective, because let me just read this paragraph. It says, the feminine subject is something that precedes the masculine subject, the movement of its constitution. The feminine subject is not organically included in reality as its part. It is, on the contrary, what makes every reality not all, the operator of its inconsistency, just the negative gesture of withdrawal. Subject as masculine, in its masculine mode, completes reality through its own exception from it, while subject, in its feminine mode, incompletes reality. It is a less than nothing, which by of being added to it, included into it, makes it inconsistent, right? So I say this because the logic of perversion is similar to the logic of the feminine logic, But in the feminine logic, we have a not all, right? Well, in perversion, we have an objectivity. And I think this is crucial because in both of them, the A is included, but the A in perversion is included with knowledge, right? Well, in the feminine logic leaves this gap of non-knowledge, right? This is why it's left this is why reality becomes inconsistent, right? And in the contrary, in the masculine logic, which is more like the obsessive one, is by repressing the subject, right? And the subject is not included into the reality, and that's why reality becomes objective in the masculine formula, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that reference. That's very useful. Thank you, Luis. Please, actually.
I had two things. One was a sort of I had a sort of funny literal reading of the She-Man comment, which is I guess a lot of the people who are sort of into trans women are called chasers, who, for example, specifically may chase by having like a fetishistic investment, for example, in specific organs. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, the words did seem to also fit something like that. But I mean, part of the other paragraph about the sign S bar day, which represents the response given by the other with capital O at the end of what is posited in desiring enunciation, is precisely the gap or defect or flaw. Like, I don't know. I mean, there's this weird, at some points, like perversion is like a thing. Like it's sort of like a pathology that's like isolable and sort of bad. And I mean, in some sense, a defender of the faith, I guess. I don't know if bad is the right word, but on the other hand, it's also seems kind of general. Like in this like definition is almost like perversion is what sort of shows up failure. And in the later paragraph, it's like, it's almost like an allusion to Heidegger, where he's going like, this is rendered as this seizing something primitive or primordial. But it's also, I mean, if you're thinking about like the whole, like that paragraph is about the quote unquote progression of critique. And all of the progression of critique is restoring small a to big A in the sense of asking, well, I mean, if Hegel did that, what are the conditions of possibility such that Marx could write, so I mean, like, in the sense that, like, even if you accepted everything this person said, like, what would it necessarily imply? So I don't know, I mean, there seemed this, like, movement between its pathologization and its, like, much more general structure.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's many profound insights. Connor, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of this like she-man like gender stuff that's going on here, but when they were talking about perversion, I was and like what plugs up castration, I was reminded of the earlier mention of the money fetish. I think that seems to be maybe a callback to that. Because even though, I don't know how much Marx Lacan has read, but the money fetish is like the biggest fetish for Marx, because especially for the capitalist, because you can lend out money and it collects interest and it comes back to you. So it seems as though there's no workers involved. It's money that makes money, right? And it appears that way to capitalists. But it's also very perverted because money and capital accumulation is of course tied to science. And the thing for perverts is that Louis was alluding to this, this is also like conquest of knowledge stuff. It's producing knowledge. But for perverts, for all of that, they get no enjoyment out of it. They get no pleasure out of all of this, which seems to be a big problem. And yeah, and the neurotic's a different problem. But how they get pleasure and everything. But that seemed to be maybe significant, you know, how the fetish is working for plugging up castration, maybe.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the neurotic gets pleasure off of the fact that the object A is in abeyance to them, and that the barred other of the signifying chain is full of repressions and contradictions and snags and so on, especially for obsessional neurotics. That is what has to be broken from them. The strategy for an analyst to deal with perversion is obviously a 180 from that, because the object A is, in some sense, I guess in some sense in neurosis, perhaps the object A has to be identified or found or brought out into the open. Would anyone like to read this final section here? I think we are at, in order to end on another of my play on words.
Yeah. In order to end on another of my play on words, which the current state of our language allows, why not play with the word omel and transform it at the lower level of the graph into female? Femme sounds like femme, woman, and il means he, hence he, woman, question mark. Doesn't this female seem to make the metaphorical function of the family itself flash before our eyes? Do you want me to finish it or just that paragraph?
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
If what the pervert needs is an uncastrated woman, or more exactly, he makes her uncastrated and omel, can't the femme-il be seen at the horizon of the neurotics field? This something which is a quote-unquote he somewhere, but whose quote-unquote I is truly the stakes of what is at issue in the family drama? It is objet a qua liberated. The neurotic is the one who poses all the problems of identification. He is the one we must, at the level of neuroses, deal with in order for the structure of what we must resolve to be revealed, namely the signifier of barred A, structure, Todd court. It's just interesting
Nice
how we
work.
returning to identification too, even at the very end of this session. But
Yeah, because in a certain way, isn't it true that the pervert is, they don't pose problems of identification, because in some sense they've found a solution to the field of the other. Right? So for them, they found a solution, just like Pascal has found a solution, while they know, they have knowledge also of the barred status of the other. They found a solution for how to get around that. Pascal is a genius because he finds a way to believe even when science has proven that God doesn't exist or God isn't consistent, right? So, yeah. Noah, please.
So I'm just kind of wondering, in regards to this object A and the contents having to be emptied out, in regards to the big other has to be emptied out of its contents, which is only by the pursuit of object A in order for it to become a barred other. So I don't know if that was even explained right, but I'm just trying to understand this situation when it comes to encountering the other of the other, the otherness of the other. Because when we have a conceptualization of an other, that is a totalized object that we are fetishizing in a sense. And in order to really encounter, and I think this is probably I'm kind of on a Badu trip right now, but in order to encounter the otherness of the other, we have to somehow pursue this object A in order to empty out its contents, to see that it is a barred other, like to encounter the otherness of the big other, which is that it is barred. Would that? I'm just trying to.
Well, I mean, the effect of the inconsistency of the other is merely apparent by virtue of language and speech, is the claim that Lacan is making. So he's not making a kind of Levinasian ethical claim about our access to otherness and to the totality of the other. He's not really working at that register. For Lacan, the other is simply like the mark of the unconscious in our speech, which constantly reveals that inconsistency. It's something which well, I think can be proven on multiple different levels for Lacan, but he's not trying to, I think, like provide a sort of negative theology proof for coming to terms with the lack in the other. Not exactly like that, I would say. But I'm not exactly clear on how but I think I see the operation that you're trying to get at, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure that it needs to be taken or assessed at that exact level. Also because he's talking about just trying to help psychoanalysts understand distinct structures of the psyche. You know what I'm saying? And how those distinct structures relate to the law. Like perverts don't repress. They don't repress, they disavow, right? This is unique structures, and therefore they have like very different relationships to the field of the other. And again, the field of the other also, I think, should really be understood also in most cases as like how the subject is related to the mother as well. If we're talking about the other with a capital O, right? So it depends on which register we're coming at it from, because I think part of the problem with Lacan is that he suggests that the subject supposed to know is God, but then he's also using that same concept to describe the transference. So he intentionally obscures these things and conflates things. I can see why it gets confusing in some ways. You know what I mean? Because you know what I'm saying? He's linking up like a theological discourse along with an analytic discourse, and he's conflating them along with a philosophical discourse.
But that's intentional.
So they're all conflated. Yeah. It's all a bit maddening, or but I think he's trying to provoke us. Go ahead, Akshay.
I don't think it's a conflation, like in the sense that I mean, it's this like dialectic of the clinical and metapsychological claims of psychoanalysis, even in like Freud's work, like where I mean, he has these clinical observations, but then he goes like, no, I know the truth of human civilization. He writes Totem and Taboo, and anthropologists kind of hated it. They were like, you don't know anything about what you're talking about, but nonetheless, like, I mean, the more psychoanalysis I'm reading, I'm like, oh, this is actually quite interesting. So I think psychoanalysis does have something to say in these sort of because of metapsychology, but also like it is something that exists in the world outside the clinic, which is part of what I think Lacan is trying to get at when he's saying like a subversion in the status of knowledge that it's not just the clinic, it's the psychoanalysis in the world. And presumably the subjects of a world in which, psychoanalysis exists will behave differently because, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's putting it too like crudely, but like kind of, I don't know. I mean, I think it's connected to his whole argument about sort of a politics of analysis, not in the sense of necessarily like analysts going out and doing politics, but what are the political effects of the existence of an analytic discourse, right? Like that, for example, Freud would write something like Totem and Taboo or The Future of Illusion. I mean, I think those are things that have political effects.
Yeah. No, it's true. And of course, I think also the status of belief is different for the neurotic than it is for the pervert in some sense. And I think that Lacan will play with this category of atheism and belief, and because you see, he's capable of showing that in some sense we're constantly reinventing like this notion of the big other, to come to a ethical determination that the big other does not exist, in some sense, is both the outcome of a successful conclusion to one's analysis, i.e., one would have the tools or the equipment to face such a reality only on condition that they have touched their fundamental fantasy through the work of psychoanalysis. But then if you say that, then you're kind of overselling the Lacanian method as a new asceticism for which only a new priestly caste of people that have undergone analysis can truly live in the world with the courage to not, allow their unconscious to invent some reliance on the big other. I think that's actually where we would fall into the territory of a kind of Lacanian ideology if we submitted to that formula. I used to think that when I was younger. That's actually what attracted me to Lacanian psychoanalysis, that there was almost like that Nietzschean community, that you do analysis because you'll fortify a different type of relationship to faith in some sense. If Lacan is right about like in other words, you could say for Lacan, like modern atheism is rare, or modern atheism is an achievement in some sense. I think the problem with that is that then the presupposition there is that it's required to undergo analysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, to, I don't know, conquer belief properly or something. There's more to be said about that, but that, yeah. Okay, go ahead, Connor.
I just want to clarify a little bit in the sense, like, I didn't mean as much as like undergoing analysis, like, I mean, because when we're talking about the social effects of the existence of analysis, I think that is much broader than just the people who go to psychoanalysis, right? Like, I mean, when you're talking, so I wouldn't conflate those two things. But sorry, go ahead, Con.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I get what you mean, actually. It's a good point to make, because it seems like a point Lacan is returning to again and again throughout. But yeah, while you were talking, Daniel, it seems as though, like, I've just been thinking about like this problem of really like the death of God. It's pretty much just like a problem of how is it that we substitute the big other, and this is such a big problem because basically with the secularization of God or science replacing God, it's like really what's going on is that there's no room for useless activity, right? And useless activity is like exactly where you find pleasure at work, right? So if all of your activity has to be rational, has to be in some way informed by a relationship to the market, and so on. Everything has to be informed by some orientation around knowledge and the pursuit of it. Then where is pleasure in all of this? Where is enjoyment in all of this? And, you know, it makes people unhappy, you know, especially neurotics, right? Because they used to be guided by some notion of God, right? That would tell them what to do. And now they have to plug that God-shaped hole in their heart, right? So, yeah, it's just something I'm increasingly like thinking about, you know, because it seems like a big problem today, even, you know, so.
But yeah, I mean, I always think of analysis as not so grandiose, of like reshaping how we relate to some sense of otherness, because I think we want to avoid thinking of otherness as some kind of theological or homogeneous category that sort of just is. It's like ontologically. I think that on the contrary,
Well, to put it in
to
another
know,
way,
like,
like
yeah,
we live in a world that we basically know everything, right? But that has come at the cost of meaning. We know everything, but our lives have become less significant and less meaningful. And that's just because, again, you know, like the big other, when it was oriented around God, didn't necessarily have to be this sort of like, you know, utilitarian, basically, right? So, yeah, I hope this is making sense. Like,
that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Luis.
Well, I have never been to analysis. I'm much of a pervert in that way, but I think that a ruler, right, the state should have an idea of psychoanalysis, of going through therapy, because I think that most people don't go through these perverse, you know, obsessive stages. It only comes when, you know, something that is supposed to be censored, you know, happens, and the state is there to, you know, be there to give the correct censorships, you know. So, you know, like fake news, for example, you know, the chaos could go loose if you don't censor that, right? So, because if not, we follow the same logic of, you know, the free market, like everyone should be, you know, pure and, you know, should be saints and all that, right? And that will never work, and that will never happen.
Very interesting, guys. Yeah. Well, thank you, Noah, for asking the big questions. Yeah, bringing out the big philosophical questions on us in this late hour. Any other final thoughts before we close for the night? Well, very nice session, everyone. Thanks for wokeness. Censorship is our new god. Nice. Yeah, that's good. I'm not sure if I agree, Connor, that we know everything. I'm not sure that this like yeah. Oh, maybe we can talk about that in a future point. Because I think that like the demand is not to know everything like that. It's a demand for, what is it, like self-knowledge, like that savoir-faire, like that kind of knowledge, which is a knowledge of a know-how, which is a knowledge of a practical knowledge and knowledge of life. And that is something which is never in our possession. So maybe what you're talking about is like knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge, or sort of like knowledge is like, the internet, we have that. So is that what you mean by that?
kind of, well, kind of like, well, regardless, like Lacan sort of like, if you look for it, he like does this a lot, where he just kind of alludes to like we no longer live in like an enchanted world, you know, something to that effect, you know.
Yeah.
And in that sense, like I think he says that with the emergence of science, you know. So it's this sort of attitude that we can know everything if we don't already know everything, and that's come at a cost of you know, really looking at the world with wonder, you know. being like inquiring, wanting to know, being, you know, aware that you might not ever know, but it seems as though if you really like want to know, you could. And that's where I think, you know, the cynicism of our age is like especially prevalent. You know, it seems like everything's like already taken care of, automated. Um, we know how things are going to turn out, like a sense of fatalism and dread. You know, maybe I'm a Debbie Downer, but I feel like people feel that way. So I'm kind of alluding to that, but
I I did notice some interesting like parallels with the dialectic of enlightenment talks about, and the concept of enlightenment talks about the subject as a reference point. And so I started kind of going back there and like I just kind of like refreshed my mind a little bit, and it seems it gave me the impression that um perhaps Lacan is like a futurist in some way. Like there does seem to be more of an embrace of like the subject of science. And I mean, like you're talking about like more of the dialectic of enlightenment side of like subjectivity in the modern world, where like the subject has no more purpose, everything's been objectified in a way, and that thought really doesn't have like a critical function in society. It's not really needed or something. And like that seems to concern Adorno and Horkheimer or whatever the subject of science is. But I think there's just an interesting confluence of ideas there around the reference, the subject as a reference point.
no, they rhyme a lot. And you know, Lacan has like said a couple of times over sessions, you know, analysts are getting stupider, you know, something to that effect. So it seems as though it's like it's helpful to think about the dialectic of enlightenment. You know, they often rhyme this reading, and that I totally agree.
It's also the source for a lot of that in the dialectic of enlightenment would be like Weber and his kind of like iron cage of rationality kind of thesis. But I mean, I think for that reason, like, you know, as Marxists, we should be a bit suspicious of the. I mean, I don't know. I mean, in the sense that I do think like it is a sort of relatively undialectical formula of this of like, you know, of science as this kind of like the death of curiosity in the world. And I mean, I don't know, as a child I was really into Carl Sagan and kind of the whole Pale Blue Dot. So I'm sorry, now I'm just rambling and saying things, but I mean there's a very direct connection, say, through Weber with dialectic of the Enlightenment. And but I think I agree with Matilda, but I think like Lacan is kind of going on a much more kind of like futurist in the sense of like we kind of like in a non-science fiction, like, you know, in the sense that Quentin Meillassoux has this like science fiction and extra science fiction where he goes like, you know, there's science fiction where we go to a world where we can, oh, we had science, now we have more of science, you know. But he's like, with extra science fiction, we kind of go to a world where the conditions of like scientific knowing sort of break down. And instead, we have a new relationship to knowledge. Because science is not something that just fell out of the sky. Like, I mean, sure, maybe we discovered certain facts about the universe, but like the concrete existence of science as a social relation depends on all kinds of social institutions, you know, including governments and scientists. And like, if like, say, the repeatability of experiments to assure their falsifiability like broke down, then you wouldn't have science as a social institution. And you would, you know, like move from science fiction to maybe a fantasy novel, but even in the sense that that's how it would be experienced, right? Because you no longer have the authorities who give you that kind of certainty. But I mean, you know, is that like, I don't think that's just a reactionary, like, I think with Kant, he's citing like there's something, yes, human subjectivity is sort of limited and finite and can't just, you know, look shit up on Wikipedia and have figured it all out. But that's, you know, that's not necessarily a problem. Or I mean, you know, if it's a problem, like, you know, how that.
Anyone else wish to jump in, like Greg or Aaron?
I must say that going back to what I said about censorship and science, I mean, one of the best breakthroughs of science comes when there was censorship, about certain topics. So, and the truth is that it's not like there is no censorship. There is censorship, but it's hidden, right? And when it's exposed, on the contrary, we see the barriers, and we want to overcome those barriers, right? And there cannot be progress if we don't see the barriers. And this comes like with what is his name, Lyotard, like this idea that we should reject a synthesis, right? We should reject a new institution. Like we should keep, Lyotard talks about, we should keep like these wounds opened. So we should remember these wounds when, I don't know, when in fact there is still an institution. This is what Lacan talks about, the capitalist discourse, right? There is still the master, but it is hidden within this sterilization, right? And I mean, our goal should be to expose the master, right? So we can overcome it.
Yes. Yes. No, this is interesting. Yeah. There's a fabulous book on this whole notion of like modern disenchantment by Marcel Gauchet. Disenchantment of the World on a Political History of Religion, where he does a genealogy to try to pinpoint at what point in European history did disenchantment fully become actualized in the culture. And his answer is really nice. He says it's basically when you had Christian asceticism, because Christian asceticism created a scandal that the Christians could not account for, which is that they made the Eucharist a fully immanentized ceremony or liturgical process. And once they did that, then what allowed for enchantment is a transcendent conception of divinity bestowing onto humanity something enchanting. But once Christianity made that material and inside of the world, it ruined it. And anyways, I thought that was kind of funny. It's the same thing with Lacan's notion of the absolutization of the market, right? Origin of capitalism in a certain way. All right, guys. Well, we've gone over time, but I think this has been a great session. And on to the next one for next Tuesday. In the thing, I don't have to send out a Zoom thing. It'll be in there. It's called Knowledge and Power next time. So, very Foucauldian title.
Also a dialectic of enlightenment theme as well. Knowledge and power.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to stress. Once I did read it, I was like,
I'm not a big fan of dialectic of enlightenment myself, but we can talk
about
that.
I don't know what it means. I mean, I've only read the first essay a few times, and it's provocative. I find it interesting, but I don't know what it means, really.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it in the future. I'm not sure that I agree that Lacan is really on the same wavelength there, to be honest with you.
That's totally
but
fine.
well, yeah, let's chat about it. Honestly, the big thing from this is that seminar 17 after this one is so much is so like building off of all of this. You know what I'm saying? In such a glorious way. Because all of these demonstrations, the figures that he gives here, are nothing in comparison to what he does in 17. Nothing. He goes through some kind of metamorphosis in the brilliance of his diagramming. Seriously, like the math themes that he comes up with in 17 are spectacular. once you have that full conceptualization of each of the four discourses, it's galaxy brain stuff, you know? It's really good. And then you get those Lacanians who say, oh, the Lacan of discourse is the worst Lacan. I was talking to Samo about those Lacanians, and we're like, we don't like those people. It's not fair that they say that. And they tend to be the most like math geeks. There's a correlation between if you're a super math geek Lacanian, you hate the Lacan of discourse. It's crazy. I don't understand why. I don't understand. Do you know why, Luis? I don't know.
I think they have this fate for a stronger order, so they're not satisfied with his with his formulas. They're two perverts.
I know, like when I talk to Gabriel, like I refuse to talk to him about it because he just like derides everything about the discourses. He thinks everything in this period of Lacan means nothing. Anyways, bothers me. Okay, all the best, guys. We'll talk soon. Peace out. Have a good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.